I'd like to share the progress that I've made by implementing requisition routing through the backend databases. Now, requisition routing can normally be implemented through under the purchasing requisition master files. And in those files, you'll be able to see the 6 different screens that you can use to set up requisition routing. And those screens are the users, queues, rules, nodes, routes, and groups. When you're implementing requisition routing, you usually follow this series, starting with the users, going down to the queues, and so forth. What's important when you're doing it through the back end is you should have the user manual. This is called Oasis PO Routing Training. And in this document, it talks about all of the different features and attributes for each of the tables. Even though it doesn't specifically talk about the tables, I'll show you exactly what I mean. In this particular document, it also follows the user, queue, rule, node, route, and so forth. For the most part, each one of these sections has 2 tables to go with it. The exception is that the node table only has 1, and the rule table actually has 3. So that makes a total of 12 tables. The good news is 2 of those tables really don't need to be managed through the back end, and so it only leaves 10 tables to deal with. So let's take a look at those tables. These are those 12 tables, and starting with the user down below, we got user and user group. Then we go to the queues, queue and queue user, rules, rule account and rule detail, nodes, only one node table, rec node, routes, rec route and rec route path, and then finally the groups, which is just the rec group route. Now the rec user group can't be completed until you've defined the group, so which is why in the manual it even says at the very end, return to user maintenance, and that's where you assign those following groups. In each one of these tables, you can click on this table, you can look at the data, and I've already put a filter in where district number equals 12. And what I've simply done is right-clicked on the data, open as spreadsheet, and clicked open as spreadsheet. I did that for all 12 tables, and the result is here called recroutetable.xls. I'll include a copy of this table to this video. You can see the tables down below follow the same logic, rec user, and at the very end is this corresponding rec user group, because remember, we have to define the groups before we can fill that one in. Other than that, everything follows the same logic, queues, rules, rule account, rec node, rec route path, and so forth. So let's take a look at each one of these tables. The rec user table, you could see the column headings at the top, and we could scroll through and you'll notice that not everything is used. For example, RFU isn't used, absent end date, notify status. Those are only used if there is an absence. But the bottom line is to understand what each one of these fields mean, you just simply have to go to the PDF file. Let's take a look, for example, user maintenance on page 8. Under user maintenance, you'll get to see each one of the fields. For example, let's see, add from existing user, we need to get down here, notify. The notify field corresponds to the notify method. You could see that E would be for notifying via email, M would be for notification via QSS messaging system. And it says at the time of this publication, M wasn't available. But you could see right here what I've done is left that blank. You can only do this through the back end. They won't let you leave it blank through the front end. But by leaving it blank, it allowed me to be able to implement this in a test and copy environment and not have email notifications sent out. I included a little list here of information, a little note. And basically, the rec user is a complete list for those entering requisitions and those approving requisitions, and also anyone that needs to monitor a queue. So it basically is just everybody in the kitchen sink. If a user is not listed in here, they won't be able to interact with it at all. You can keep on going through and seeing the different fields that exist in this table, and it tells you exactly what these fields are for. Not all fields are listed. For example, the RFU flags are not listed in that PDF document, and they're not utilized. Finally, there is an audit date, time, and audit ID. These audit dates and time is basically the date and time a change was made. And the audit ID is the ID number of the user. Now, it doesn't really matter what is put in the audit ID. So for example, I put SCIM, it's just a reference. So the next time somebody goes into the user interface and edits that record, that audit ID will change to them. This SCIM is something that Will Hohen suggested I use for Santa Clara import. Okay, so that's the rec user. The rec queue, just simply when you're doing an implementation, ask every department that would need to have a requisition created. So that's, for example, every school site, any department that has its own budget would need to create a requisition. In addition to every department that has to review it, you have to kind of think ahead a little bit. And what I mean by that is you have to think of the different rules that are going to be created. For example, I've got a rule called block object, CBO limit, board limit, pre-purchasing, and purchasing rule. In general, each one of these rules will need its own queue, unless you can use an existing queue. So for example, as it turns out, for the CBO limit and the board limit, they want those to go to the same queue that the CBO department is in. So when I created the CBO department right here, I'm able to use that one queue, and I didn't have to create extra queues for those two rules. Again, every one of these fields can be found inside the manual. The rec queue user simply relates every one of the queues with the user. So the way I developed this one is I started off with the queue names, and you can see these are all the ones that have the yes. So I took all the queues from rec queue, and I identified the owners. Every queue needs an owner. So that was the first thing I did. Then I took a list of all those owners, these ones right here, and I determined what users were left over in my user file that weren't listed in here. And that's all of these. I listed those users here, and then I worked backwards to say what queue do those users belong to. Again, you have to define the queue first before you can assign it to a user. On the rec rule is basically asking the site what are your special rules. In our case, there was only, let's see, 3 special rules. One is 25,000 goes to the CBO, 96,200 goes to the board, and do not allow object codes 1 through 3XX. So that's 3 rules, 1, 2, 3. And then the last 2 rules, I don't know that she said it in here, but we were asked by the Director of Fiscal Services that in the beginning, they wanted to see everything before the purchasing manager saw it, just so they can keep an eye on it and touch it. So we created something called a pre-purchase rule, and then we created a purchase rule for the purchasing manager. And so we've got real basic 3 rules and 2 rules that will probably be in every implementation. The next rec rule is the rec rule detail, and that is what do these rules do? Again, using the manual, you can find more information on the rec rule detail. And here you'll be able to see all the lists of the operators. In this case, though, it's very hard to read that one. So what I did is I went into the Requisition Master Files, went to the rules. I have to go inside the rule. And when I'm in the rule, I do rule help. And this is where it showed valid operators and the predefined variables. And so each of the rules that you're seeing here, this is what's reflected in my rules right here. So the block object is simply saying the object is in between 1,000 and 3,999. You could see that it's got a sequence of 1. If I had another rule that the block object also had to be dealing with, that would give it a sequence number 2. In my case, each rule only had 1 criteria. CBO limit was the amount is greater than 25,000. Board limit amount is greater than 96,200. The purchase rule and the pre-purchase rule and the purchase rule, we just did an amount greater than 1 cent. That means if it's greater than 1 cent, it's going to satisfy that rule. The next one is the rec rule account, which is really a table that is possibly irrelevant, and I might not even have touched it. All it is you take every single rule. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rules, and you expand them by 20. So the block object rule has 20 lines in it, and it just goes sequence number 1 through 20. That's it. That was all that was in the table. I did not try to just leave that table blank. I just populated it with this since the system seems to do the same thing. That was a real basic table that was not really hard. When it comes to the node is now tying together the queue and the rule. So basically what the node is saying, and let's do something that's on the block object. It's saying, for this node, if the block object rule evaluates as true, then send the requisition to the business finance queue. If the CBO limit evaluates as true, then send it to the CBO queue, and so forth. Now up here, we've got some kind of funky ones that are going on, and I'll explain these one. Let's start with the auto. The $auto is basically a system rule that always evaluates to true. So in other words, on this particular line right here, the rule ID is always going to be true. So when the originator, or when a requisition is created, it will say, always send it to a queue with the user as the variable. In fact, what's happening is QSS will actually auto-generate a queue based upon the user's ID. So if me, Jim Carrillo, logs into QSS, creates a requisition, after I create a requisition, it will automatically, meaning it will evaluate as true and create a queue for me so I can see my requisition. This is nice so that a user can submit a requisition but then approve it afterwards while they've had a chance to think about it or talk to their boss or whatever it might be. It's not necessary. The other one that we're seeing here is, this is saying auto. This is absolutely always going to happen. And this is saying to look up the group that the user is assigned to. Once you look up the group, then identify the queue that's related to that group and send it to that queue. So this is a little different than user, except that they're both variables. This one is auto-generating a queue based on the user's name. This one's looking up the queue based upon the group that the user is in. And then we go to rec route. Now the rec route is a pretty easy table, especially in a generic implementation. You simply have two routes, the global beginning and global end. This will assume that everybody's requisitions will follow similar rules. If in fact you have a department that has very specific rules, for example, Title I funds, maybe you don't want everybody's requisitions to hit the rules of Title I funding, but only the Title I department. This is where then you would add additional routes for that. In this particular implementation, we went pretty straightforward, global beginning and global end. Now, don't get this confused with the actual terms right here, global routes. We just called our routes global beginning and global end, but any route that you identify can be identified as the beginning route and the end route. We just happen to call our beginning route global beg and global end. So don't let that confuse you, that just by calling it that will define it as a global route. Going back to the Excel file, what we'll see here on this next one, on the rec route path, we are now going to define for each route what's the path that route takes, or the different nodes, and the order of those nodes. So let's see, for example, we've got two routes for the global beginning, and then the global end has the remaining routes. So let's look at this one. The first one is, for global beginning, for everybody, we want it to go to the originator's queue, and for everybody, we want it to go to their group's queue. Again, you can look at the documentation for what referral flag means. Now that the beginning of that route has been established, it's got to be approved by basically, for example, the site admin, and then it will go to the site administrator. After those two are done, then what we're going to say is the global end is going to check each one of the existing rules. And remember, there was 5 rules, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the global end is going to basically check each one of the rules, and it's going to make sure that the purchasing is the last one. Now, I put the pre-purchasing before the CBO limit and the board limit because I wanted to make sure that the Director of Fiscal Services saw this requisition before the CBO saw that particular requisition, so that they can, act on it. Now, in the future, if we get rid of this pre-purchasing queue, then it will just go from the originator group and then straight to the CBO for their review here. The rec group now then ties the group ID to the queue. There are two items that are automatically created by the system, and that the way that those two items are created is when you click on this global routes icon and you select which ones you want to be your beginning and your end. Because the system creates those routes, I chose to not add those through the back end. I tested it. I could add them through the back end, but I just felt that it was important on those particular ones to allow the system to generate it. That might have just been a personal fear. So on this particular table, if you notice, if I take a look at how many group IDs I have, there are 31, not including those first two. And if I go back to the very beginning and say, well, how many queues do I have? There are 31 of those as well. So it's a real basic way to copy them. There's a basic way to set those groups up is you simply start with the queues, create a group for each queue. The rec group route is also something that's created by that selection of this master routing master file. And so for that reason, I do not touch this particular table. I'll just let the system touch it for me. And then finally, the rec user group, it's like going all the way back to the beginning and say, okay, we have our users. If we go way back to the beginning, and we should see, let's see how many users do we have. Looks like there's 63 users. If we go back to the very end, you'll see that there is going to be 63 users again. So 63 users, and the key on this one is just simply assign each user a group. And as long as each user only has one group, they get a primary flag. It is possible to create assign a user to two groups, and in which case you would, for example, in this particular case, it would look something like this. Since this is the second group right here, and let's just say I'm going to assign it to that group, this would be a sequence number of 2 and a primary flag of n. All right, so that was an example, but I'm going to knock this one out to return my information back. All right, so now how do I get the data into QSS? It's very easy. Simply highlight all the data, right-click, copy, and then go to its corresponding on the rec user. Hit the plus. See how it says null? I'm going to use Control V for paste. And then it asks, do you want to add 63 rows? I click Add Rows. And then it shows you all the rows that I've added. And you'll see that it's got a duplicate record on this one. If I try to save it, I can't save it because it doesn't let me violate the key, duplication of it. So I'm just going to refresh the data. It says don't save, and then I'm back to normal. So if I wanted to, I can just delete all of these District 12 user accounts to recreate them. But that's as hard as it gets. You just go to each one and paste the data. Once my data was in, I'm just doing the finessing now back in this main area. And don't forget, you have to add that route. Now, I even went so far as to play around with the, I shouldn't say play around, I actually did it. I backdoored the users. In order to backdoor the users, I had to create an app user parm. The app user parm needs to have, let's see, the record type user, and then I had to have the rem user. This is what sets up their passwords. And you can see that each one of these have the same password and the same salt key and key. Doing it this way allowed me to then set the password, the same password for all the users. So in the test environment, now I can have myself log in as each person to test it out. I can also have the site purchasing manager log in the test environment. So it's kind of a nice way to be able to basically use the sandbox I shouldn't, I use test environment and sandbox as interchangeable, but basically use the sandbox instead of giving them access to our copy environment. The other thing it does is I don't have to load this in production until we're ready. And once we're ready to load in production, it just flows on through. And then finally, the user class has to be updated for each of the users, purchase pilot, change year, and LS pool only. Um, so what I found was this was really easy for me to do for the new users. For the existing users, though, that were in QSS already, I had to do some queries to find out which one of them didn't have purchase pilot, change year, and LS pool only. And I also had to take into consideration, if we look over here to the priorities, you can see that we assigned the first one a priority of 2, the other one a priority of 1, and the other a priority of 90. Um, doing it through the back end, you don't have the visibility of the existing priorities. Um, so what I had to do was I also, for the existing users, I had to take a look at anybody that had I had to look at their priorities to make sure I didn't overlap them. And that's how we implemented requisition routing through the back end. The total time it took us to do this was about 2 weeks of data crunching. And I would say maybe on average about an hour a day, maybe 2 hours. Towards the end, we had to do a lot because I had to do a lot of learning. But I would say that if I produce this over again, within a week, I could knock out any given district as long as I had some information. By the way, the other thing that I did was when I was working with the site, I just had them give me the email addresses of the people, and I referenced QSS, the tables and the CARP tables, to pull in then things like their name and their user ID and stuff like that, as opposed to having the site look that all up. For me, it was just easier to do it through a database.